As you guys were having a chat and talking about your morning routine, I wonder if this sounds familiar to any of you guys. You know, kind of wake up a little bit bleary-eyed, and maybe the first thing you do is you reach for your phone because, you know, we know that's what we all do, unless we actually intentionally have put things in place to stop ourselves from reaching for our phone and maybe reach for our Bibles instead first thing in the morning. We reach for our phone, and maybe a lot of you open up a news app on your phone to see what's been going on in the world. And maybe that you open it up on your phone, or you turn on the TV, or you get a newspaper if you're old school, on whatever your news source of choice is, whether it's Fox or CNN or the BBC if you're from England like me. But you open it up, and this is what you read about. This is what you hear about. You hear about an act of mass gun violence on the streets of a U.S. city. And you read about an earthquake somewhere in the Far East. And you read about a coup in an African nation. And you read about a politician who's been accused of fraud or an improper relationship or election interference. You read about escalation in tensions between China and the U.S., right? You read about another wave of economic instability. You read about a hurricane or a cyclone on track to cause a whole bunch of flooding and destruction, normally in Florida. You read about a celebrity who's on trial for some kind of abuse. And you read about yet another escalation in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And you read about political parties at each other's throats over the issue of the day. Whether it's abortion, whether it's LGBTQ rights, whether it's critical race theory, whatever it might be. There's division all the time, right? That sounds like a bit of a bummer way to kick off. Sorry about that. But the reality is that studies have indicated that 90% of the news that we read is negative. In part because negative news sells, but also because there actually just is a lot of negative stuff going on in our world. And with so much ugliness in the world, so much violence, so much division, so much tragedy, it makes you wonder, is this it? Like, is this the end? I don't know if you ever stopped to consider these things, or maybe if you didn't before, maybe the couple of years that we went through with the global pandemic made you cause to start thinking differently and start to consider those things. Or what's the deal like with the end? Is the end coming? How do we know that the end's coming? All of this kind of stuff. The reality is, whether we've thought about it or not, there is going to be an end to this age that we live in currently. The Bible in general and Jesus specifically is very clear on that. You know, this current age is going to end in the return of Jesus, which, if you want a technical term, is called the parousia, is the Greek word for it, the return of Jesus, and the judgment of all people. You guys were not ready for this coming to church today. You're like, I wanted to come to church, hang out, sing a few songs, eat some donuts. But this is the reality that we live in. There's going to be a judgment, and all who are declared righteous by Jesus the judge get to enter into a new glorious age in which God is going to make his dwelling among us. That's what the Bible says. It doesn't say that we're going to get to go to heaven and float around. It says we're going to get brand new resurrection bodies, and that God is going to make his dwelling with man. That's pretty incredible if you stop to think about that for a minute. But when it comes to thinking about the end of the world, or really the world's not going to end, the age is going to end, because there's going to be a new world, there's going to be a new heavens and a new earth, if we want to get technical about it. But there are kind of two extremes. Maybe you fall on one or the other. The first kind of extreme is people who just want to figure it all out. Whether you're a pre-millennialist or a mid-millennialist or a post-millennialist or an amillennialist, whether you know what any of those words mean or not. You know, is there going to be a rapture? Are God's people all going to be snatched up and disappear all at the same time? If there is it going to happen before pre-tribulation or post-tribulation? Like, is there going to be this big, horrific tribulation time on the earth? Well, do the Christians go before that or after that? All of these kind of things. People and Christians and non-Christians alike have been trying to accurately predict the end of the age for forever, for thousands of years. There have been hundreds of public predictions down throughout time, all which so far have been proved completely wrong, because I think we're still standing here, right? But people are still trying to figure it out. So you've got the people on one end who are trying to figure it all out. On the other end, you've got the people who kind of really just want to stick their heads in the sand and not think about it and not worry about it. People who just don't want to think about the end coming, or don't want to come to terms with the fact that things actually might get worse before they get better. Even for Christians, sometimes, I don't know about you guys, but even if we're awaiting the return of Jesus, which is a glorious thing, thinking about it can be a little bit disconcerting. I mean, even though it's going to usher in this new glorious age, the unknown is still scary, right? You probably all find yourself somewhere on that spectrum between those two kind of extremes when it's thinking about the end of the age. But what we're going to do, I want to do over the next 2 weeks, is take a look at what Jesus had to say about the end in Matthew 24 and 25. Because it's actually quite a seemingly confusing and often misunderstood passage of Scripture. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at Matthew 24 this week, and then hopefully Matthew 25 next week. And so today, it's going to be kind of we're going to get into the Bible today. Is that okay with you guys? Like, not that we don't not get into the Bible, no. But we're going to kind of go through verse by verse, which is not normally our MO when we preach messages, but that's what we're going to do today. So if you do have a Bible or paper or on your phone or a tablet or something, you might want to pull that out, and so you can follow along with me. And I'm not going to read, we will read the entirety of Matthew chapter 24, but not offhand, just for the sake of time. I'm going to kind of read some verses and jump around a little bit as we kick things off, and then we're going to kind of go through it together. You guys with me? Are you all like, oh my word, we're talking about the end of the world? That's kind of scary and a bit too heavy for a Sunday afternoon. Well, if you get a bit overwhelmed, just take a nap. There's some couches at the back. Just take a little bit of a nap. You can catch up later on YouTube, and then just don't get overwhelmed. It's okay. This is good news, you guys. This is not bad news, okay? Okay, so we're going to start with Matthew chapter 24, starting at verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and all these are the beginning of birth pangs." Jump down to verse 15. "So when you see standing in the holy place," that's the holy place in the temple, "the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then that those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again." Down to verse 26. "So if anyone tells you, 'There he is out in the wilderness,' do not go out. Or 'Here he is in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east, is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken." And then jump down to verse 32. "Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Hang on a minute. There are some parts of this chapter that seem to be a little bit confusing, but surely the big one has to be verse 34 right there. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until these things have happened. And if, in case we're any doubt that Jesus was serious, he goes on in the next verse, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So if Jesus is talking about the end of the age, the end of the world, but yet he says, hey, this generation that's living right now are not going to die until they see it. What's up with that? Either Jesus was wrong, or Matthew misunderstood him when he was writing his gospel, or Jesus is not actually talking about the end of the age, he's talking about something different. Let's take a little bit of a deeper look and figure this thing out, shall we? This whole discourse, this whole conversation with Jesus and the disciples begins with a question from the disciples that Jesus then answers, okay? But if we look at verses 1 through 3, the disciples don't actually ask Jesus one question. They actually ask him two questions. Jesus left the temple and he was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to these buildings. And they said, do you see all these things? He asked, truly I tell you, not one stone will be here left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. The disciples are like, man, look at this incredible building. They're all from Galilee up in the north. They're from the sticks. And so they come down to visit Jerusalem and are like, oh my word. It's like when you guys from the Central Coast go to London. Like, it's kind of that. Look at this. We don't have anything like this. They're amazed, but Jesus is like, this is not it. This is not eternal. Not one stone is going to be left standing on another. And then they leave the temple and they head across the Kidron Valley and up onto the Mount of Olives. And from the Mount of Olives, you can see the temple. It overlooks the temple. So they're sitting there on the Mount of Olives. Jesus is sitting on top. They're looking at the temple. And as they look at it, the disciples turn to Jesus and they say, like, tell us, when's this going to happen? When's the temple going to be destroyed? And, question number 2, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So 2 questions. Question 1, when's the temple going to be destroyed, like you said? Question 2, when are you returning and when's the end? Okay? 2 questions. And if we read Jesus' response as 2 separate answers, then things make a lot more sense, okay? The disciples thought that their questions were related to the other. They were like, there is no way that the temple is going to be destroyed and the end is not going to come. They couldn't conceive a world in which the temple and the system of temple worship didn't exist. But as Jesus goes on to show them, actually, they're not the same thing. They're not the same question. They're 2 separate issues. So let's take a look at that. Verse 4, Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places, and all these are the beginning of birth pangs. So Jesus starts out by saying there are a whole bunch of things, wars and natural disasters, things that people believed in the ancient world to be signs of the end of the age. There's all these things that you think are signs of the end of the age, but actually they're not. He says about those wars and the earthquakes, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Can you think of any time during the history of humanity when there have not been wars or natural disasters? There haven't, have there? As long as human beings have been on this earth, there have been wars and natural disasters. So think of wars and natural disasters as a sign that the end is here. Doesn't make any sense. Jesus says that they're the start of birth pains. It's the beginning of something, but they're far from being conclusive signs that the end is near. The next thing on the agenda, Jesus says, is that his followers should expect suffering. Then you'll be handed over and persecuted and put to death, and you'll be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So believers are going to turn away from Jesus. They're going to turn their back on him. They're going to betray one another. Their love for God and one another is going to grow cold. These things are going to happen, but they don't give us any timeline for the end. Only that the gospel is going to be preached in all the world before the end happens. But what does that mean? That's open to interpretation. Because Paul was able to claim in the first century that he had fully preached the gospel in a large part of Asia and Europe in the first century. Did that mean that every single person in that period that he was talking about had heard the gospel? It didn't. So if we're to take that as a literal every single person, every person in every remote village in India is going to have to hear the gospel preached before Jesus returns, I don't know that that's completely true. If we're kind of kicking back going, we've got ages for Jesus before Jesus returns yet because not everyone's heard the gospel, I think we could be in for a bit of surprise. So these opening verses, the things we've looked at so far of Jesus' response to the disciples, they've kind of really been a digression from answering the question that the disciples asked him. He's given them a series of examples of things that should not be considered signs of the end. But now he starts to answer their first question. Verse 15, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through Daniel the prophet, let the reader understand. Then that those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go back to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. So as I said as we were reading it, the holy place is the temple. It's the inner court of the temple that Jesus is talking about. And the abomination that causes desolation is an idolatrous affront to the worship of God. So Jesus is quoting Daniel right here. And in Daniel's original prophecy was when a statue of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, it was set up in the Jewish temple by the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes. And it was set up in AD 168 BC. That was what Daniel was prophesying about, the abomination that causes desolation. And after that statue was removed, the Jews kind of revolted and rededicated the temple. That's what the Jews celebrate at Hanukkah. Okay, that was just to tie in the events. That was what was going on there. But so Jesus wants to take that prophecy of Daniel and apply it to a new situation that they find themselves in. 30 years after Jesus spoke these words, there was a Jewish revolt that led to a war with the Romans, the Jewish war, and it happened between 66 and 70 AD. And the Romans ravaged the villages and the farmland throughout Judea. They laid siege to Jerusalem, and they ultimately destroyed the temple. The abomination that causes desolation, Jesus was referring to, was probably the Roman standards that Roman soldiers carried. If you've seen Gladiator or any kind of movies like that, you know what I'm talking about. These big standards that the soldiers carried into battle, and they had various creatures shaped and molded, often out of metal, precious metals, on the top of these standards. And these creatures symbolized the various gods. And the Roman soldiers would actually worship the standards that they carried around with them. So the abomination that causes desolation, round 2, that Jesus was referring to is probably those Roman standards as the Roman soldiers entered the temple in AD 70. So these verses that Jesus is talking about almost certainly don't refer to the end of the age, but they refer to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Does that make sense to you guys? And then he continues. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, these days will be shortened. And at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I've told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, don't believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there's a carcass, there the vultures will gather. So the longing for a Messiah, for a king who's going to come back, kick the Romans' butt, restore Israel to the Jewish nation, whether that's Jesus or whether that's an alternative Messiah. I mean, that's going to be such a strong longing at the time of such a national crisis as the Romans, a war, the Romans destroying everything, including the temple. But Jesus warns them, as much as you want a Messiah, don't be deceived into thinking that that's my return right there. Don't be deceived into thinking you're going to have to go out to the wilderness to find me. Don't be deceived in thinking you're going to have to seek me out hidden away in a room somewhere. Because he says that his return is going to be like lightning. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. So like lightning, Jesus' return is going to be sudden. There's going to be no warning. There's going to be no signs. It's going to be bang, there he is, just like lightning. You know, we talk about thunder and lightning in that order, don't we? We talk about thunder and lightning. Really, we talk about it in the wrong way around, because lightning always comes before thunder, because light travels faster than sound, if you want to get scientific about it. We really should say lightning and thunder, but it doesn't roll off the tongue as well, so we say thunder and lightning. But there's no warning for lightning. It's bang, there it is. But also, just like lightning, Jesus' return is going to be visible. As it says, like lightning that happens in the east, you can see it in the west. You're not going to have to seek out Jesus when he comes back. The whole world's going to know about Jesus' return. It's going to be sudden and it's going to be visible. This is a really, really key verse because it informs so much of how we understand everything else. That Jesus' return is going to be sudden and it's going to be visible. Then we come to verse 29. And if this is not a description of the end, I do not know what is. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. That sounds pretty scary to me. That sounds pretty crazy. But actually, Jesus still hasn't got there yet. He still hasn't got to the end of question 1. He hasn't moved on to question 2. Because the first thing he says there is immediately. So if he's talking about the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and then he says immediately after, he can't be talking about something else that's going to happen at some point in the future. He's still got to be talking about this moment in time. And what he does here is he quotes Isaiah 13:10 and Isaiah 34:4. And in highly colorful and symbolic language, it refers to the fall of Babylon in the Old Testament. The Old Testament city of Babylon, it refers to its fall. So even though that might sound completely over the top to us to describe the fall of a city, if that was how in the Old Testament Isaiah described the fall of Babylon, how much more appropriate is that kind of language for Jesus to use to describe the fall of Jerusalem? God's treasured possession, God's holy city. We're not literally talking about the stars falling from the sky right here, but it's symbolic language to talk about just the impact, the disaster that this moment is in AD 70 when Jerusalem fell. Does that make sense? Okay. We're getting there, you guys. You still with me? We on board? Okay, here we go. Verse 30 then. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Okay, finally, Jesus is coming back to earth now, right? Well, actually, no. There's something that's really important that we have to do when we study Scripture, and that's we need to keep the Old Testament and the New Testament together, okay? So you guys all know that the song, The 12 Days of Christmas, right? But I don't know if you know this, that the 12 Days of Christmas was originally written by Christians to help new believers understand the basic tenets of their faith without letting others know. It was actually written by Catholics, but letting others know, Protestants know that they were Catholics. So a partridge in a pear tree is Jesus hanging on a cross. Two turtle doves is the Old and the New Testament, and so on and so forth. Each one symbolizes something to do with the basic tenets of the Christian faith. Okay, so two turtle doves, the Old and the New Testament. And as I was driving home from picking up the donuts this morning from Bonds, right outside my house, there were two doves sitting in the middle of the road, just walking along. And I'm driving up, and they are not moving. They are sticking together. They're not scattering here, there, and everywhere. Eventually, I slowed right down, and I got that close that eventually they took off. But they both took off together, and they both went and sat together on a lamppost, just right there together. Because it's two turtle doves, because doves stick together. They mate for life. And it was just a beautiful picture this morning of how we're not supposed to separate the Old and the New Testament. The two have to remain together. We get into trouble when we read the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament. It's easy to go, oh, it's just a whole bunch of people killing themselves and a vengeful God. Jesus is much nicer, so let's stick to the New Testament. But we have to read the New Testament in the light of the Old Testament. Otherwise, we get confused and we get things wrong. So this is really, really important right here. Because in these verses which talk about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, we have to understand that the Son of Man is a phrase that was used by Daniel in the Old Testament. And these verses right here are an echo of Daniel 7:13 through 14. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a who? A son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven, and he approached the Ancient of Days, which is the Father, and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. So the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory is not so much a picture of Jesus coming to earth, it's a picture of Jesus coming to the Father to receive power and glory and authority. Does that make sense? If we read what Jesus said in the light of these verses in Daniel, that's what's happening in here. It's not Jesus coming to earth quite yet. It's Jesus coming to the Father to get power and glory and authority. So why then, if Jesus is going to the Father to receive this glory, power, authority, why do all the peoples of the earth mourn? How does that make sense? Why would people be mourning when Jesus receives that authority and power from the Father? Well, a better translation, or an alternative translation of that verse, might be, rather than all the peoples of the earth, all the tribes of the land. if we translated it as all the tribes of the land, if that's more accurate, it will be a picture of all the tribes of Israel mourning over the fact that they got it wrong, that they were wrong to reject Jesus as the Messiah, as they see him receiving, metaphorically, symbolically, receiving power and authority from the Father. Then they mourn because they missed the Messiah, the one that they'd been longing for, the one that they'd been waiting for. So now we come to the end of Jesus' answer to the disciples' first question. When will the temple be destroyed? And in this context, now verse 33 makes a lot more sense. Verse 34 makes a lot more sense. Let's read this from verse 32. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. Soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. What's near right at the door? The destruction of the temple. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So when Jesus said this generation is not going to pass away until all these things have happened, he was referring to the events that happened 30 years after he spoke these words. So Jesus wasn't wrong. He didn't mess up and get it wrong. He was just not referring to what we typically think he was referring to. So that's the end of his answer to question number one. Finally, we come to his answer to question number two, right? The one that we really want the answer to. When are you coming back, and what are the signs of the end of the age? But Jesus answers a little bit of an anticlimax. After all that, he says, but about that day or hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And I'm like, seriously, Jesus? That's all you got for us? That's all you're going to tell us? He goes on, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. There's going to be no signs. There's going to be no build-up. There's going to be no advertising campaign to let you know that Jesus is coming back. The election of the next president of the United States does not happen until November 2024. But back in August 2022, Republican Corey Stapleton became the first to officially announce their candidacy. Back in August 2022. So the campaigning started over a year ago. The primary debates have literally just started, but yet we're not even halfway there yet. Electing a president is a long, drawn-out process. But that's not what's going to happen with the return of King Jesus. There's going to be zero warning, zero signs, bang. He's going to be back like lightning. There's no point in trying to figure it out. Look at what Jesus said there. Who knows when he's coming back? The Father. Even Jesus in his earthly form did not know when he was coming back. So if Jesus didn't know, what right do we think that we have to try and figure it out when he's coming back? It doesn't make any sense, does it? We're not supposed to know. But how about this? Instead of using our time and our energy to try and figure out Jesus' return, what if instead we take all that time and all that energy and we get ready? While the disciples are the ones who start off the conversation, Jesus seizes the opportunity to tell them something crucial. They ask him a little question, and he goes for 2 chapters. After he's explained to them about the destruction of the temple and given them a little snippet and let them know, hey, look, no one knows the time that I'm coming back, not even me, right now. He tells them 5 stories about the importance of getting ready. 5 stories, back to back. Doesn't even take well, maybe he took a breath between each story. But back to back, 5 stories. Do you think Jesus wants us to get this? We're going to look at the longer ones in Matthew 25 next week, but there are 2 shorter ones that he kicks off with, and we're going to take a look at those real quick together now. Looking at verse 42, Jesus says, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you must also be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." Verse 45, "Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of his servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, 'My master's staying away a long time.' And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour when he is not aware. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." So what does it mean to get ready? Well, firstly, before you dash off to the store, it doesn't mean that we all need to become preppers. It doesn't mean that we have to all start stockpiling food and water and ammunition or build bomb shelters in your backyard. If you do that already, awesome. Go for it. It's a good thing to be prepared for natural disasters, definitely. We have a kit of stuff. If there's an earthquake, living in California, that's a smart thing to do. Bottles of water and wind-up flashlights and all sorts of things like that. But we don't need to become preppers. That's not response number 1 when we talk about what it means to get ready. If we look at the servant in Jesus' story, what was he supposed to do to be ready for his master's return? He was supposed to look after the other servants. He was supposed to not mistreat them. He was supposed to not party with a whole bunch of friends that were not good for him and neglect his responsibilities, basically, right? That's what the master expected him to do. The servant in Jesus' story was supposed to be prepared for his master's return by living a life that pleased his master. That was the key. He was supposed to live a life that pleased his master. And for me, working at home most of the time, that generally means I'm wearing sweats. It generally means I shower before lunchtime, but occasionally it doesn't. But it means if I actually then have to go out, leave the house to go to a meeting or something, I have to get myself ready for that moment, right? I have to, shower if I haven't done so. I have to, dress. I have to do my hair. I have to put shoes on, all of those kind of things that, are appropriate to do before you leave the house. Unless, of course, you're going to Walmart, then you can just go to Walmart wearing your pajamas or whatever else it is that you want to wear. But I head out, do my point. When I come back, I'm back in my sweats again. If the president, whoever we end up electing in 2024, was to come and visit San Luis Obispo, there'd be a period of getting things ready, wouldn't there? The place would be beautified. There's some painting, I'm sure, that would go on the buildings. There'd be some gum that would be cleaned off of the streets downtown. There'd probably be some homeless people that would be cleaned off of the streets downtown. Is what would happen if the president was going to come. There'll be this period of getting ready. But getting ready for Jesus' return is not like that. It's not getting ready for a specific event. It's not getting ready for the arrival of the president for a one-off meeting that we know when and when it is. It's not like me getting ready to go out to a meeting, on a Tuesday afternoon or whatever else it might be. Getting ready for Jesus' return is about living a life that's ready. It's about living a lifestyle of readiness, a life that pleases God. And the good news is that you can start living a life that pleases God right here, right now, today. Because the life that pleases God is not a life that passes a certain bar. God hasn't set a bar and said, hey, everybody has to get to this point. Everybody has to spend an hour in prayer every day. You have to read 3 chapters of scripture every morning. You never yell at your wife or kids. Never cuss at other drivers while you're commuting to work in the morning. That's the bar. And if you do all those things, you're living a life that pleases me when I return. And if you're below the bar, then that's not a life that pleases me when I return. That's not the point. That's not what Jesus is looking for. A life that pleases God is a life that's dedicated to him. It's a life that's more and more and more mirroring the life of Jesus. It's not a life that's cleared a certain bar. It's a life that's heading in the right direction. He wants you day by day to put him first and to seek to please him. And this really is where all that we've been talking about as a church this year comes in. Those of you who've been around will know, and those of you who haven't won't, but we've really been focusing ourselves this year as a church and going forward on becoming apprentices of Jesus. The Bible uses the word disciples, but it's kind of a word that it's hard to get our heads around these days because we don't use that word, do we? We don't. If you're a manager at work, you don't talk about, the people who work for you as your disciples, do you? That would be weird. But the word that kind of has the closest connotation that we, of discipleship that we use in the English language today is apprentices. Jesus is calling us to become apprentices to him. And as apprentices to him, it's to reorder our lives around 3 goals. The goal of being with Jesus, the goal of becoming like Jesus, and the goal of doing what Jesus did. So as a church, we say our vision is to be a family of Jesus followers. To be a family of Jesus followers who are living life to the full every day, being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, doing what Jesus did. And if ever you needed any motivation to do all that stuff, to do all the things that we've been talking about, to adopt the practices of Jesus that we've been talking about, to live his life, this is it right here. Jesus is coming back and he wants you to be ready for when he does, by living a life that pleases him. What's a life that pleases him? It's a life reoriented around those goals of being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, and doing what Jesus did. That's what he's looking for. What was the fate of the servant who didn't please his master? It says that he was assigned a place with the hypocrites. That's really powerful right there. He was assigned a place with the hypocrites. The Greek word basically means an actor. That's what a hypocrite is. It's an actor. It's someone who pretends to be something that they're not actually not on the inside. And isn't that the very thing that society throws at the church, throws at Christians, that we're a bunch of hypocrites, that we're just pretending, that we say one thing and then we live our whole lives a completely different way? That's what people say. And if we're not living this life that we're talking about, we're not living a life that pleases God, then the sad reality is that's exactly what we are. We are hypocrites. Next week, we're going to explore a little bit further these other stories that Jesus told about how to be ready for his return. But for now, let me just leave you with what Jesus said in verse 44. He said, "You must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." When do you least expect Jesus to return? Probably right now. Right now is probably the time I least expect Jesus to return. And it probably always is. Whatever time of day it is, whatever I'm doing, whatever's going on, right now is the time that I least expect Jesus to return. So why would he not return right now? Who knows whether this is going to be the last time that we gather as a church together in this room? Jesus could come back this week. He could return at any moment. So let's be ready. Let's commit ourselves to living a life that pleases God. It doesn't mean we have to reach a certain bar. It doesn't mean that we have to be continually on the lookout and stressed and anxious and worried. That's not his heart for us. His heart for us is that we would just live a life that pleases him. That we would commit to reordering our lives around those goals, being with Jesus, becoming like Jesus, doing the things that he did for as long as we have left on this earth.